So now let's talk about the bandwidth indicator. The bandwidth indicator is very interesting because it gives us a reflection, kind of like an oscillator, but it's showing us the width between the bands. Here's how it's going to work. It's going to measure the distance between the upper and the lower band. In other words, it's telling us how wide that spacing is. Now there's going to be two real signals that you get. You're going to get the squeeze and the bulge. During a squeeze, your bandwidth is going to be very low because it's reflecting that low volatility. It's tightened down. And during a bulge, your bandwidth is going to be very high, again, because that volatility has come in there. So let's take a look over here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Notice across the bottom here, this is your bandwidth indicator. And look at your squeeze. You see how tight the bands are here? And look how low the bandwidth is. Now, it seems like it's kind of an obvious signal, and it is a relatively obvious signal. I mean, you can kind of get the same data just by looking at the bands, but this is an interesting way to present it. It also provides some interesting opportunities for scans and whatnot by just simply scanning for bandwidth readings. So take a look over here as we get into the bulge. Notice how your bands have started to separate out. This is a bulge, and look at your bandwidth indicator as it's continuing to go higher and higher. So what you can see here is when you've got a squeeze, the bandwidth will start to tick higher as the squeeze is expanding there. Then as you get a bulge, if it's going wider, the bandwidth will keep going up, but if it starts to contract a little bit, the bandwidth will actually start to come down, and sometimes it will start to come down before you would even have normally seen that in the Bollinger Bands themselves. Come on over to another example on the same screen here. Here's a picture of your squeeze. You see how small the spacing is. You see the bandwidth and what's happened here. And then, of course, that expands into a bulge. Now watch what happens on the right side of this bulge here. Look at how the bandwidth starts to drop off quickly. And look at what's happening with the stock. In this case, the stock is starting to go flat as those bands are starting to contract and show that this massive movement in volatility is coming to an end. And so that's the benefit, and that's kind of the general idea here of what the bandwidth indicator is going to do. It's going to show those expansions and those contractions on more of an oscillator type formation. And then, of course, we can use that for a lot of different things. One thing a lot of people like to use it for is for scans. They scan and they say if bandwidth is below this percentage point here, then those are the kind of trades I want to go look for. Again, because the squeeze would be coming up. So here's your formula for the bandwidth. The bandwidth formula is really straightforward. You simply take the upper band and the lower band. You subtract the lower band from the upper band, and then you divide it by the middle band. So whatever the upper band's doing, whatever the lower band's doing, you do the subtraction there to get the differential, and then you subtract it by the middle band, and that tells you the width of what's happening with those Bollingers during that time. Now there's a couple of signals that we get. The two main signals are going to be the squeeze and the bulge. Of course, these are the two kind of primary signals you get with the bands themselves. The bands contract and the bands expand. Naturally, those are going to be the two signals that you get with the bandwidth indicator. Now let's look at a few distinctions with each of these. With the squeeze, here's what's going to happen. It's going to be a low point in the bandwidth, a very low point here. It's going to reflect contracted volatility. The movement of the stock has contracted and it's not moving quite as much as it used to be moving. It's forecasting an increase in volatility, and this is a really, really important point right here. The reason you want to find low bandwidth, the reason you want to find squeeze opportunities is it's forecasting an increase in volatility. Of course, that's where you're going to make your money as these non-volatile moves turn into volatile moves where there's a lot of movement happening. Another way of looking at this is when you see a squeeze, when you see a low bandwidth, it is the beginning of something. That's a really valuable way of thinking about this. The squeeze is the beginning of something. The bulge is the end of something. And so you've got the squeeze and you've got the bulge. The squeeze, low volatility, low bandwidth, and it's the beginning of something big that's about to happen. Now let's take a look over here at a couple of squeezes. This is back on the Disney trade. Notice how tight that squeeze was. Notice how low the bandwidth was. And of course, what happened? Well, the stock broke out and we had a 15-point move in just a couple of weeks here as the stock started moving bearish. Now, if you come on over to the next squeeze that we had here, the really solid squeeze, low bandwidth here. Of course, as it breaks out, this one happened around earnings, but again, we had a pretty good sized move, another $15 or $20 move that happened in just a couple of weeks. Now, we had a couple other small bandwidth areas. Here was the low point, and this was a squeeze that did break bullish, but it started to kind of oscillate in here, and this would be a good time to look back at your percent B and see how that oscillation was playing out there with your percent B. So that's how the squeeze starts to show up here in the chart. Remember, the squeeze indicates that something is about to break loose. It's a really important concept to understand. When you see the squeeze, when you see low bandwidth, you know that's just a matter of time before something breaks loose. It cannot stay that low for a prolonged period of time. All right, now let's look at another example over here. This is on Halliburton, and I want to show you on a very solid trend how the waves of the trend are kind of fleshed out here with this picture. That's another important concept to understand. When we have trends typically move in waves, or another word that's often used as legs. There's a first leg, a second leg, or there's a first wave, a second wave of the trend. And those trends will typically run up and then sideways and then up and then sideways, or they'll run down and then sideways and then down and sideways. We see that being diagrammed very clearly here with the Bollinger. So take a look at this Halliburton trade. This was a long bearish trend. Notice we had a low bandwidth, we had a squeeze that was happening, and it starts to break below the band. It starts to break bearish. We had a very sudden surge of movement here. It's about a $15 move. Look how big the bandwidth got. And again, this was expanding for the volatility component there. And as the bandwidth said, okay, I'm done, and it starts to cycle back down, what happens? The stock moves sideways for about a month. Then what happens, the next thing, we got a squeeze, it starts to break bearish. As bandwidth gets really large, again, it starts to move sideways and the stock gets stuck. Then we get into another squeeze that actually stayed really relatively tight for quite some time. It moved on up eventually, but it did take a while to get there as we were forming a base here with Halliburton. But again, the idea is you recognize the squeeze, you see the bulge, you recognize the squeeze, you see the bulge. Another important thing to understand, and another idea, is you can look at relative levels. Remember, everything with Bollinger is quite relative. So you look at this Bollinger bandwidth indication down here, and you can kind of start drawing areas where you say, whenever I get down to this area, it's about as tight as it's going to get. You can look at the highs and say, whenever I get up to this area, it's about as high as it's going to get. So that's going to be the extension of those bands. That's going to be extension of the bulge. When you start to get that wide, you know it's not going to keep going that much longer, because relatively speaking, we're kind of overbought, if you will, or overbulged on this bulge that's happening here. So that's another way you can look at this information. Now, speaking of the bulge, that's the second signal that we get. The first one's the squeeze, the second one is the bulge, and here's what the bulge reflects. It reflects a high point in the bandwidth. In other words, the bands have expanded really, really wide to help encompass some of that volatility that's come in. This is going to reflect expanded volatility, and here's the key. It's forecasting a decrease in volatility, also the end of something. If the squeeze is forecasting the beginning of something, the large bulge is forecasting the end of something, because again, it just cannot stay that volatile for an extended period of time. Let's take a picture over here and notice this is the same chart here on Halliburton that we just talked about. We were so high on the bandwidth here, it had moved so far bearish. And also, if you were looking at the percent B, you'd see we were way outside the band here. You know this is unsustainable, and certainly the trade moves sideways. Now, if you're a stock trader, if you've shorted this stock, you kind of don't care. You can just hold it. But if you're an options trader, this is gold for you, because it's telling you this is the surge I'm getting into, and once that surge is done, I'm out of the trade. And when you're dealing with that time component that we deal with when we trade options, this is a very, very valuable insight. Look at the next one over here. Again, we had the bearish gap down here, pushed outside, and look at how the stock slows down. Bandwidth was huge, and as the bandwidth starts to fall off, the stock stops its falling there, and that volatility is coming out of the trade. So that's the way these squeeze and bulge pictures are going to show up here on the bandwidth. So let's take a look here at this Halliburton trade, and let's add now the percent B with that bulge. And notice what's happened. So you've got your bandwidth, it's starting to come down. You've got the stock starting to slow down, it's starting to go sideways. And look, we've got lower lows and higher lows. There's your bullish divergence. This happens so frequently. You get a bulge and your bandwidth shoots up, then as your bandwidth starts to come down, you get that divergence. It is a very, very valuable signal. It's telling you this is the end of that leg, the end of that wave, whatever it is that you're dealing with. It may or may not be the end of the trend, but certainly the end of that surge of energy that has happened at that time. And as a stock trader, maybe you don't care, but as an options trader, you really care a lot because you don't want to be stuck in that time component where you're holding through those little corrective moves. So this is a very, very valuable signal, and it's very much worth your time to learn to recognize it. So what we've learned here is we've seen how the percent B and the bandwidth work together. You understand how each of them work a little bit. What I want to do in the next video is I want to show you how we can start pulling it together. Take the percent B, take the bandwidth, and we add it in here with the three main plays that we learned about back in the first lesson, so you can start pulling it together as part of a system.